So greetings and welcome to the 2025 National Invasive Species Awareness Week kickoff. Our theme for this year's NISAW event is Enhancing North American Biosecurity to Protect Against Invasive Species. My name is Christy Trifone-Millhouse, the Executive Director here at the North American Invasive Species Management Association, also known as NISAW. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping notes. We're excited to have you all join us. As I mentioned before, share with us in the chat where you're joining us from. Also, after our presentation today, please feel free to use the reaction button to let our presenter know that you enjoyed today's topic. We will be hosting a brief Q&A after the webinar, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. All right, again, welcome. We're kicking off this week for the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. NISAW is an international event powered by NISAW to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat that they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. NISAW provides a platform for individuals from local, state, federal, tribal agencies, regional organizations, private industry, and citizens to discuss legislation, policies, resources, and improvements that can be made with elected officials and decision makers. This is a week not only for learning, but for action. Throughout the week, we'll be sharing links with you in an effort to connect you with your U.S. senators and House representatives. We want them to hear our collective voices and to learn about the importance of this work and why we need support and funding to continue to move forward. For those who want to take a more active role this week, please head to NISAW.org and find the NISAW toolkit filled with template social posts, press releases, PSAs, and more. If you aren't currently connected to us on social media, please join us and share our daily posts. We have quite a week planned for NISAW with presentations focusing on the theme of enhancing biosecurity at all levels. We encourage you to visit our website to register for these webinars. If you're unable to attend live, we'll be posting these presentations to our YouTube channel after the event. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our agenda has changed quite a bit over the last month. I'd like to take a moment to thank those federal employees who have invested their energy and heart into this work. Some are no longer leading these efforts at the national level, while others are still holding strong. NISAW is driven by education and action. As a partner, we recognize that now is not the time for us to take a step back and sit down, but rather as partners to stand up and move forward together. I encourage you to activate your networks behind our calls to action and to provide support to programs that need a bit of glue right now in any way that you can. Through partnership and collaboration, we are stronger. And this is truly the essence of our work here at NISAW. As leaders of NISAW is deeply vested in our mission to empower all of you and to empower the management of invasive species across North America. We are led by an 18-member board of leading experts and professionals with supporting committees that I encourage you all to consider joining, a strong NISAW team, and a membership that continues to grow by numbers. NISAW continues to be one of our most far-reaching events with over 2.9 million people participating in last year's event. Here at NISAW, we provide the connections, the tools, and the collective voice you need to address invasive species. We frame our programs around these core pillars. We work hard to provide opportunities for collaboration and connection through our webinars, summits, our annual in-person conference, and experiences like today. We equip our members and those in the invasive species community with the tools needed to manage and educate the public about invasive species. And finally, we strive to provide that collective voice on a national platform to advocate for relevance and support through our government relations programming And again, events like today are NISAW. Some of our upcoming events you won't want to miss include the 2025 National Forum on Biological Control in Annapolis, Maryland from April 14th through the 17th. The meeting themes revolve around biocontrol research, management, and impacts in natural areas. And we've got a great speaker lineup. So I encourage you to register today if you're interested in networking in person with members from the biocontrol community. Another great event you won't want to miss is the 2025 NISMA Annual Conference. Mark your calendar and plan to join us in Lake Tahoe from November 3rd through the 6th. Our theme this year is charting a new course. And again, we've got some great speakers already lined up. I hope to see you there. Head to NISMA.org to register today. As a friendly reminder, your membership dues help to make our mission come to life. If you're not currently a member, we offer a variety of different membership options. You can view our new membership structure on our website at nisma.org. Want to sponsor NISMA in a bigger way? Our new Premier Partner program is designed for you. Premier Partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and even more. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our 2025 Premier Partners whose generosity made NISAW and other NISMA events possible. Okay. Now, time for the main event. I'd like to introduce NISMA's Education and Prevention Manager, Tegan Wilmot, who will be moderating our webinar today titled The Role of Primary and Secondary Introduction Pathway Management in Effective Biosecurity. Tegan?
Thank you, Christy, and hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Christy mentioned, I am Tegan Wilmot. I'm the Education and Prevention Manager at NISMA, and I will be moderating today's webinar. To get us started, I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Deah is an assistant professor of invasive species biology and management with Penn State University and one of our board members. And we have her full bio on the NISAW website. Deah, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And again, for everyone watching, please be sure to put any comments or questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, so we can be sure to answer your questions after the presentation. And Deah, I'll have you share your slides now.
Thank you for the invitation to give this talk today and to participate in NISAW and to be I think the first presentation for the week. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you about primary and secondary introduction pathways, how we manage those, and how that fits into effective biosecurity across the country. But to get started, I just want to sort of put this in perspective. And the next few slides are going to be about how much invasive species cost us globally and nationally. And this figure here is from the IPBES report, the Global Assessment on Alien Invasive Species. It was a multinational group that got together to do this global assessment. They crunched thousands of papers, all of these different data sets. Really, if you have a chance and if you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend checking out that report. Just an amazing amount of information packed into one place. One of the things that they did put together was this global estimate of annual costs of invasive species. And so the figure you see, the average annual costs over the years 1970 to 2019. Important to note that this has increased about 4 times every decade, the amount that we're losing in these costs. In 2019, it was estimated to be around $423 billion globally. Now, that's 1 year, and it's also very likely that this is an underestimate. So keep that in mind with all of these numbers. In the US, here, this is some work that was done. There's a group called InvaCost that's putting together a database of different expenditures and costs associated with invasive species. And this paper came out for the United States, where over the years 1960 to approximately 2020, it's estimated the US has incurred about $1.21 trillion in invasive species costs. with that looking like about 20 billion per year. And the map shows you just how that breaks down. Of that 1.21 trillion, about 17 billion in the Southeast, 29 billion in the West, and quite a bit there in the islands and territories. So the other thing they discovered was that agriculture was the most impacted sector, with 510 billion of that $1.21 trillion. So, this is pretty impactful to the farmers, to us, to taxpayers, et cetera. And then this is from the same group looking at pre-invasion management versus post-invasion management. And in the pink, you see the top 10 species that were spending money on management post-invasion. And then in the blue, it's the top 10 species in pre-invasion management. And you can see those numbers are much lower on the blue side. And in fact, we're spending about 25 times less on prevention, which isn't necessarily the most efficient way to spend our money. So talking a little bit about invasive species as a global problem, we know that they cause impacts. We know they fuel natural disasters, thinking about some of the big fires, like the fire in Hawaii, fueled by invasive shrubs and grasses. And we know that invasive species are one of the 5 drivers of biodiversity decline. And that goes with things like land use change, over exploitation of species, pollution, and global change. And this figure is showing about 51% of the vertebrates, or I'm sorry, 218 invasive species have caused about 1,200 local extinctions, with 51% of those coming from vertebrates. Most of that happening on islands. And then about 32% coming from invertebrates, and still quite a bit from our plants, 15% of those extinctions tied to plants. So one, species can have quite a bit of influence on biodiversity. And we also know that the rates of invasion are growing rapidly. This is work that's also in this IPBES report. It's work done by Hanno Siebens. He's been tracking the number of species accumulations of established non-native species over the years, and has this great data set starting at year 1500. And this one's up to 2015. And you can see right around the late 80s, we have this uptick in the number of species that are accumulating in these different taxonomic groups and across these different regions. And the really important thing to notice from this figure is that most of those lines are not saturating. They're going to go up and up and up. And this can be attributed to globalization, increased trade, greater accessibility to different areas. So this is a problem that is not going to go away. And giving the first talk, I have the honor of being the first to show the invasion curve. If you're not familiar, this is a figure that we use to talk about management, and really more of the applied side of invasion ecology or invasion science. And this is simply showing that over time, the area infested is going to increase, and the efficiency in management decreases as the costs increase. And so you can see that along the bottom here. It's divided into prevention, eradication, containment, and long-term maintenance control. And so as it sort of plays out, first you have your species introduced, and that's right on the line between prevention and eradication. So ideally, we want to stop them before they are introduced in that prevention portion, but the next best is to get them in the eradication phase. And this is when we're actually detecting the species. It's starting to establish. We have a really good shot at eliminating those species if we act. The next step is containment. This is usually when public awareness comes in, and often a little too late. The odds of eradicating something once it hits this part of the curve are low, and getting lower as you move across. By the time you get to your long-term maintenance control here, we're really just trying to keep things under, these populations at a limit or a level that we can still use our natural areas, or limit the yield losses in our agriculture. And some, you might ask, why would we continue to put money into this if we don't manage those widespread invasions, we might lose access to whole chunks of forest and, again, losses to our agriculture in aquatic environments that could even impede travel or the infrastructure we use, say on the boats and stuff. So it's still important to manage once we get into that part of the curve, but we really want to stay down at that bottom prevention end. And so just to bring something up that recently happened internationally, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework came out, I believe, in 2022, multiple targets on how to preserve biodiversity worldwide, including setting aside more protected areas, sustainable use of species, and then this target is target 6, which is to reduce the introduction and impact of invasive species. And so with this tool, this is the text that goes along with it. Really, these bolded portions are important. To do this, to control these invasive species, they stress we need to identify and manage pathways of introduction, preventing the introduction and establishment of priority invasives, reducing the rates of introduction and establishment of other known invasive or potential invasive species. So just really highlighting here this role of pathways in management. And so what are pathways? Invasion pathways or introduction pathways are the various means by which non-native species are transported between different locations, giving rise to intentional or unintentional introductions. So here you have your source population and then the species moving. This is the receiving region. This can include the transport vector, like this little ship would be the vehicle by which the species are moving, whether it's in the cargo for this example or on the actual ship, and the geographical route, so the arrow for that. And they can be broken down into primary pathways, and that would be your source population moving across a jurisdictional or biogeographical boundary. And they can be secondary, and that's that secondary movement once you have the initial introduction. And that's usually within our jurisdictional or biogeographical boundaries. And so internationally, there's been frameworks that have been established. This is the CBD framework on pathways. This is based on Phil Hume's paper that came out in 2008, and then it was sort of expanded out to do these standards. And it's broken down into a movement of commodity vectors and then spread. The second column is your category. So release in nature, escape from confinement, transport contaminant, transport stowaways, corridors, and unaided. And that final column is the more specific. So you might be someone throwing your goldfish out into a freshwater lake, which have now become a big problem. That is a pathway, that release in nature. The next example I have here is fouling on the outside of a ship. So that would be your transport stowaways. The flatworm here is an example of a contaminant. Those are thought to have been introduced. This is a flatworm that's in the Southeast, introduced via nursery material. And then down here, your corridors and your unaideds. This is where we're talking about things like natural dispersal across borders or things following along tunnels or interconnected waterways. More recently, Caitlin Faulkner, Phil Hume, and John Wilson came up with this alternative framework. That paper just came out last year. That's a little more accommodating to secondary pathways and also easier to understand. There's a lot of overlap in that previous pathway framework I showed you. And so what they did was they divided it into active dispersal by humans, human-mediated natural dispersal, and then natural dispersal. And so that, you're going to see some of the things that might look familiar from the previous framework. But up here in the active dispersal, you have moved intentionally for release. That's equivalent to release. Next one, escape, contaminant, stowaway. Down here under human-mediated natural dispersal, that's where your corridors come in. But what they did do is, there we go. What they did do was also expand out down here what unaided looks like. So, you're moved by a human-made abiotic vector. So that could be, storms or whatnot, moved by a human-introduced biotic vector. That could be a non-native bird moving a non-native plant. And sorry, that abiotic vector, the example there is like a species moving over on trash, like what we saw with the tsunami in Japan, introducing quite a few species via the trash pile, basically. Down here under natural dispersal, we have moved by a natural abiotic vector. That would be your storms. And then moved by a natural biotic vector, that would be a native bird moving a non-native seed. And then finally, self-propelled. The bird is invasive. It has moved itself, if that makes sense. So thinking about those two frameworks and thinking about, the second one does address secondary pathways a little bit better than the first, but it was identified in that IPBES report that there was a gap. Secondary pathway classifications are inconsistent or missing. And there currently, to my knowledge, are no risk analysis processes for secondary pathways. And so I was asked by UDOI to do some work on pathways as a sort of a complementary project to the National EDRR framework, which I'll describe later. And so we held a workshop looking at identifying and ranking secondary spread pathways to enhance early detection and rapid response. We had quite a group, from research, different agencies, nonprofits, some practitioners. We covered a range of, where you were in your career, from, graduate students up to, not pictured here, Dan Simberloff participated as well. And up here, this is Caitlin presenting this framework that I just showed. And so we met for 3 days. These were our goals: to agree upon definitions, review those frameworks, determine which pathways are secondary, add pathways that might be missing, and then write up a summary. We had breakout groups, and then to try to capture all the different potential pathways. And so moving through our workshop, we came up with these different definitions for the primary pathways. Those are processes that facilitate the movement of non-native species across those jurisdictional or biogeographical borders. This typically involves long-distance movements facilitated by humans. In some cases, it can occur through natural processes, although those are rare. And then our secondary pathways, this is processes facilitating the movement within those jurisdictional or biogeographical boundaries. And this is post-border, with those non-native populations serving as the source of the individuals. And these can be moved by human or natural dispersal mechanisms. And in terms of thinking about the CBD pathways, we basically, in the time I was planning the workshop and when we actually had it, was when Caitlin's paper came out. So we didn't really have to do a lot there. We really embraced that way it was divided up. It was more accommodating to our pathways. Yeah. So here are just some of those pathways and how they break down by primary and secondary. So here, the airplane coming across, this could be the international transport of plants and animals in trade, or things moving with tourists in their luggage or on those actual tourists. For this container ship, organisms can stow away in the actual containers or within the ballast water and get moved that way. This fishing ship, fishing boat, the organisms are transported on the actual fishing equipment. They can foul on the hull or stick to the outside of the hull. Same is true for the other ship as well. But, this is the sort of new thing to think about here is the contaminated bait. So if you're releasing bait that is non-native, either intentionally or unintentionally, that could be the source of an introduction. And this little chaotic mess over here is just a pile of trash, just showing, things can hitchhike on that trash and debris, like I mentioned with the tsunami debris. Now for secondary pathways, some of these will be familiar. There are some overlap or is some overlap between primary and secondary in terms of which ones actually go into the secondary. But just wanted you to think about how things might move around within our borders. So forest pests can be transported either hitchhiking on the trucks or vehicles, or on cut timber or firewood. So you can think of the example of spotted lanternfly laying their eggs either, on the forest materials, on stone, on the train cars or these vehicles, and thus getting moved. These folks getting ready to go on a hike with their little dog, they can spread seeds and disease in some cases in the treads of their boots. It can get hung up on the dog fur, and then recreational equipment, so mountain bikes, off-road vehicles, things like that. Here we have another fishing example, but on a smaller scale. Again, organisms can hitchhike on boats. We've seen zebra mussel attaching to recreational boats, or hydrilla getting moved around on those boats. And they can also get on the angling equipment. And here's another bait release example. We've had a few species that have become established and moved around via those bait releases. And then finally here we have passive dispersal of organisms via wind, water, or birds. So those are just a few examples. It's not exhaustive, but just really wanted to get you thinking about how things might be moving. And now there's some key differences between primary and secondary pathways. And this is, we broke this down within the workshop as well. So first, your pathway complexity is different between these two. With primary pathways, it might be more predictable, well-defined, and there are fewer pathways to kind of think about. We know where to look. We have generally a good idea where to look and what to look for. In secondary pathways, things are more diverse. We have more diverse routes, diffuse, different actual mechanisms to move these things around. So it's a little less predictable, or some cases a lot less. Our scales are different. For primary, we're thinking large scale, international or national. But with secondary pathways, we're thinking small scale, localized, and varied. The boundaries are, there's some differences in boundaries. They're usually pretty clear for primary pathways. It's often international jurisdictional boundaries. With secondary pathways, it's less defined, sometimes fragmented. So you might have, we list it here, it's for an international audience, subnational jurisdictions, states, and then dealing with private land ownership. And then some ecological considerations. The species itself needs to be able to survive long distance, transport to make it across those pathways. And this usually results in the introduction of fewer individuals. For secondary pathways, the movement is along shorter distances, often with multiple pathways. And then just want to tie this to management and intervention. So with management focus, there are some differences where with primary pathways, it's primarily preventative, pre and at the border measures to avert initial introductions. And secondary pathways, we're looking usually more at eradication, slowing the spread, and mitigating impacts. In terms of governance, it's typically federal, on a national level for primary pathways. And for those secondary pathways, we're looking at federal, state, tribal, and local jurisdiction or governance. And then management costs. With primary pathways, you have a pretty high initial investment in infrastructure and biosecurity, yielding long-term benefits and savings. Think about those numbers I showed at the beginning about how much we're spending on management versus prevention. Stopping one of those species could save us quite a bit of money. But with secondary pathways, these are ongoing efforts. It's possibly escalating costs due to continuous eradication and containment efforts and uncertainty for success. And then finally, public awareness differs. It's generally lower for primary pathways, as the public might have limited interaction with those. Not everybody works, at the docks dealing with shipping containers, for example. But with secondary pathways, they're often higher public awareness, with the public more directly affected by the actual species, and this can create opportunities for targeted outreach. So the last thing I'm going to share from the workshop is, we're just kind of thinking about how we would manage pathways. Is there a framework we could come up with to help decision makers This is what we have so far, and this is in prep. I ask that you not share it if you don't mind. But basically what we came up with was a structured decision-making process where first we want to determine the value or desired outcome of the management. Next, determine the goals, and those might vary depending on what stakeholder you're dealing with. So, here we just wrote reduce non-native species, but it could be reduce non-native species that are vectoring, this disease that is, harming either our livestock or people. So those can kind of change depending on who you ask. Map the primary and secondary pathways. So depending on if you're using this for primary or secondary, our example here is for secondary, but you just want to list the pathways you think are coming into play for these situations. Pathway X here is an unknown. It's very hard this is just to illustrate our uncertainty. And then we want to evaluate the management feasibility and risk associated with each of those pathways. And so here we see pathway 2, we're probably not going to be successful with that, but 1 and 3 seem to be feasible. Depending on your resources, we might have to prioritize here. You might only have enough money and people to deal with one of these pathways. So you want to do a ranking here, and then list the possible management actions, rank those, and then the next step is executing your management. The important thing here is this is adaptive. So what you want to do when you finish those activities is reassess or assess how well you did, what worked, what didn't work, and then use that to feed back into the framework for the next time around. So this way you can stay pretty on top of the uncertainty that you might find with some of these invasive species, able to deal with some of the surprises. So biosecurity, what is biosecurity? This is the policies and procedures supported by research aimed at preventing the introduction, establishment, and spread of harmful organisms. And examples include detector dogs at airports or major ports. And here you see, this is a photo I took on my way back from Lisbon, and this very good dog had alerted on this lady here was bringing citrus back from Lisbon, which is a no-no. We also have decontamination of goods. This gentleman down here at the bottom is spraying cargo. This could be fumigation or heat treatment of goods to make sure you're not bringing things across. Or it could be signage indicating what and when to declare at customs. This is more for the general public. This is an African swine fever sign, don't pack a disease. I took this on my way back from South Africa. What I liked about this example is that it shows these bullets, might be a little tiny for you, but there are bullets for the international travelers that gives them some direction. Don't bring pork in from overseas. You have to declare if you've been to a farm that has hogs on it. And if you did do that, you need to dispose or decontaminate your clothing and shoes. So really concise, 3 bullets, tells people what to do. Some other biosecurity measures based on your pathways. Pre-border, we're looking at horizon scanning and pest risk analysis to identify potential targets and look at the risk involved with each of those. Trade regulations and voluntary standards, pre-treatment of goods, as I mentioned before, and public campaigns. Don't pack a pest being another example of a public campaign. At the border, we have inspection services. This could be baggage, mail, cargo, and also enforcement. So this gentleman is inspecting some plant material for any signs of pathogens or plant pests that might have come in on that material. We also have quarantine and inspection stations, corrective measures. This would be another decontamination treatment. And then voluntary disposal of restricted items. So there might be amnesty bins at the airport, for example. On the secondary side, some of these will be similar, but some of these are very different. We have detection and surveillance using eDNA, public reporting, and state and local monitoring. These 2 gentlemen are working on a project in Guantanamo Bay, trying to determine where an invasive disease vectoring mosquito is laying her eggs. So that's just one example of some of the surveillance and monitoring that's going on. Quarantine and movement restrictions. This giant African land snail popped up again in Florida. It's I think the third time they're dealing with trying to eradicate it. But to keep it from moving outside of these different areas, they have quarantined different counties to try to keep those species contained so they can work on that eradication. Certification of forage, mulch, and gravel can limit the spread of noxious weeds and other items. Public campaigns, again, some of these don't move a pest, don't move firewood, clean, drain, dry, etc. So now I want to just take a moment and highlight some successful partnerships, check my time here, and working, as a researcher, working with federal sponsorship on some of these efforts. So the first is USGS and Penn State, UF, LSU, University of South Alabama, working on horizon scans of organisms in trade. And I gave a teaser for the EDRR framework. This is what it looks like. Up at the top, we have our horizon scanning to create our watch lists and ID pathways. So that's these two circles. Those create watch lists, which then we go into our identification of hotspots. So now we know what we're looking for, how we think it's going to move, and where we think it's going to be. And that all feeds into this sort of wheel of, the actual management, where you've got your detection, you're identifying what species. Over here, you get into your risk screening and feasibility screening, and then you make your determination to do a response. There is, at the moment, funding for this, a rapid response fund. And that's very, very helpful in doing this. And then this is also an adaptive approach. Did it work? What worked? What didn't work? Can feed back into this process. And so we've done, vertebrates are done and published. Inverts are getting written up currently, and we're doing the assessments right now for the plants. The scope for this is all 50 states and territories. And here's an example of the list of species that we came up with for, this is for the vertebrates. With a couple of the higher ranking species, this is a puff adder, a venomous snake, and people, for some reason, want to keep it for pet. And then this catfish, the sharp-toothed catfish. And we did have 32 high-risk species here. Another example, Department of Defense and University of Florida, University of Illinois, and Boston University. This is research that was done by a colleague of mine, Luke Flory, along with Brian Allen, Waylon Dillon, and Drew Hyatt. And they're just looking at the effects of fire management on ticks and the wildlife host of ticks across different DoD installations across the Southeast, with a really big focus on human health with these tick-borne diseases. And so here's just an example. This is in revision, so another one. I appreciate if you wouldn't share, but you see at the top, this is a native looking landscape, and then at the bottom is a kogan grass infestation. And where you had the kogan grass, they did an experiment looking at the survivorship over time for these adult ticks. And it was a much higher survivorship in those invaded ranges with this kogan grass based on changes in microclimate. It's just in the kogan grass, it's just moisture, ticks desiccate. So definitely a correlation there. Brian Allen's work, he looked at these ticks to see what kinds of tick-borne disease did they have. So you can just see diversity across the bottom here are different species of ticks, but finding things like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, anaplasmosis, et cetera. This work is currently getting written up, the previous slide, and with some connections on how the tick abundances interact with fire and the host being mainly deer. So stay tuned for that, hopefully soon. The final example I'll give is USDA and UF from when I was at UF, improving predictions of pest plant invasion risk, looking at new decision-making tools. And so this helps with that risk assessment at the some of that pre-border stuff. And what we did was we compared AWRA, which is the Australian weed risk assessment model, really prevalently used around the world, to see how it would compare to the federal model, the PPQWRA, looking at a more regional scale, not a national scale. And we also updated their species distribution modeling, added uncertainty or suitability rankings, these different shades. And also updating the layers brought more precision to those maps. We do have a new project. I'm writing up the work plan for not necessarily a biosecurity aid, but something that will help with biocontrol, classical biocontrol, to try to prioritize plants for development. So to achieve effective biosecurity moving forward, we have written a white paper for NISAW along with, it's myself, Carrie Montier, Enrico Bonello, and Lee Greenwood, just, kind of putting all of this into a really tight little package. And we came up with these recommendations to improve horizon scanning, risk analysis, and management planning to include some emerging risks. And also data sharing, improved implementation of those results. 2, to enhance surveillance to enable early detection, rapid response when new detections are observed. And this would include continued support for that EDRR framework. Increased dedicated funding to support rapid eradication or containment. Again, I would say in any list of recommendations, you're going to have someone ask for funding. But it's really important to bring up because this takes effort. It takes time to build, the watch list. It takes time and effort, to run these models. And then you get to the actual implementation. You need people power. You need the actual equipment. So it does get quite expensive. Develop proactive regulations supporting containment of invasive species, and really look to strive for more cohesion of regulatory lists and activities between jurisdictions. So, for example, not every state has a noxious weed list, and we'd like to get everybody at least on the same page where we can start crosswalking some of these activities. 5, support the implementation of cross-jurisdictional containment and prevention strategies. Think about mandatory watercraft inspections and decontamination. Enhance collaboration among federal, state, municipal, and tribal agencies, establishing interagency agreements to address these risks. And finally, continue support for public outreach programs. I keep mentioning these, but here's your Don't Pack a Pest beagle. I think they originally called them all Snoopy. Don't Move Firewood, some signage that they use about burning it where you buy it. Certified Weed Products Program. This is something that NISAW offers as well as their Play Clean Go. Okay, and I'll just wrap this all up. In summary, the invasive species are costly and threaten agriculture and natural ecosystems. Prevention and eradication efforts are more cost-effective and can save the US billions of dollars. Managing pathways is an effective approach to do this. There are some important differences between managing primary and secondary pathways that need to be addressed when we think about prevention and eradication. Adaptive management can guide targeted management tailored to challenges associated with pathways. And it can also foster collaboration among your stakeholders, because when you're determining things like value and you're ranking different parts of say, that structured decision model I showed, you're going to want to bring other people to the table. And then finally, continued partnerships will result in more innovative applied approaches to keep the US on the leading edge of invasive species management. And so with that, I'll thank you for your attention. This is my email address if you'd like to email for any questions we might not cover today. But I think we have about 10 minutes for question and answer, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Deah. That was fantastic. Lots of great information there, and I know people are going to be following up to get some of those resources that you mentioned. So thanks to those of you that are giving those reactions too. We really appreciate that. And again, if you do have questions that you'd like to add to the Q&A box, that would be great. All right. So it looks like our first question here is regarding secondary sources about education and control for pet stores, sellers, and nurseries. And then we have a question about soil disturbance for plant invasives.
So thinking about some of those places, pet stores, nurseries, I don't know much about. I'm more of a plant person, so I can tell you what I know about that. With the plants, there are some efforts to hit it at the source. So you'll find some cases where master gardeners might set up at Home Depot to do some information, share some information about what you shouldn't plant and maybe some alternatives. But another nice partnership example with USDA Farm Bill money happened with folks out in California with their Plant Right program, where with funding they went through and cataloged all of the non-native species being sold at these different nurseries and used that information to develop a program, kind of like a plant this, not that process. So there are efforts. They are, again, talking about some of these scattered things. They are definitely scattered. There's no cohesive, attempts to kind of go across all 50 states and territories to make this information known. And I also say, and I have met some resistance with the pet folks, in some of the times that I've talked with them in Florida. But the nursery growers they're actually been more interested in coming up with solutions.
No,
And what's the second? Disturbance?
Soil disturbance for plant invasives.
Yeah, I mean, that disturbance is definitely, species that it definitely opens it up for species to get in there. So with the plants, you could use, identify areas of disturbance and use that as a place to go do some of these eradication or containment efforts. Again, I spent a long time in Florida, so I can really give some examples from there. But one of the things that's happening in Florida is the citrus industry is not doing well with citrus greening, which is vectored, an invasive pathogen vectored by an invasive insect. But the farmers are abandoning those orchards, and what's happening, if they aren't there anymore managing it, that kind of serves as a disturbance in and of itself, and they're having a lot of invasives moving in there. And so that would just be an example of a place where you could go in and proactively try to take care of that before the invasives took over a region or an area.
That's great. Thank you. And then a question about the decision-making process that you had. Did you have any tribes involved in that effort?
Unfortunately, no. For the workshop, no, we weren't able to make those connections. But I would say that is something that was lacking in the group. And I will also say that some of the experiences that I've had in the past year, namely, we had a really amazing question and answer session at the last NISAW meeting, and I made quite a few contacts within the tribal communities, and hopefully we can rectify that in the future. It's definitely important to have those folks at the table.
Will you be having more of those workshops in the future? Is that planned?
For this, probably not, but I actually really enjoy organizing those. It's really fun to just be in a room with people we're focused on the same topic and sharing, all of these different perspectives. So definitely going to be looking to have future workshops on different topics. So.
Oh, fantastic. And then looks like our last question here. One of our attendees is curious if you have any thoughts about the spread through range expansion caused by climate change and any consequences for management.
Yeah, so things are moving. Like that's something we can't deny. It's it's getting warmer. We're having some shifts in precipitation and weather in general. And as species are moving up, I think this would be a really good area that we could add some modifications to our horizon scanning process and actually I'll be leaving tomorrow for Annapolis for the Interagency Forum. I can't remember the whole name, but I will be presenting on a horizon scan we're doing through Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, trying to adapt our horizon scanning that we're using for the vertebrates in trade, invertebrates, whatnot, to try to predict some range shifters and other species that might emerge as problems with future temperature projections. So that would be an example there. Adding questions into our status assessments and risk assessments, that would also be helpful. I'm working on a regional status assessment that essentially we've modified a tool that was made in 2008 and added questions in each category about things like sleeper species, range expansion, any way we think that management might be impacted by some of these, temperature and CO2 changes. So we are thinking about it, but yeah. And there is a paper I just published with some colleagues that looks at that for pathways with specific to protected areas. It was a project we worked on with a workshop that happened in Stellenbosch in South Africa. So that's out in Biological Invasions and is open access.
Oh, fantastic. I might have you put the link to that if you can find that while we finish up here. But I want to thank you so much for being our first presenter for National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. And then I do have a last slide to share before we close out today. All right. And so here at NISAW, we like to end our information sharing sessions with a call to action. And today we would like to ask you to send a letter to your federal representative in the House and Senate asking to reintroduce the Lacey Act amendments. The bill would grant authority to federal agency regulators to inspect interstate commerce for common invasive species. And you can either scan the QR code or follow the link in the chat. You'll be asked to input your information into the system and it will automatically select your senator or representative. And then you can send them a letter that we have prepared. And you can also add a personal message if you choose to do so. All right. And lastly, again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We have a great lineup of webinars scheduled for this week. For more information, you can see our NISAW landing page or our events page to register. And we do look forward to seeing you at more of these presentations.